Identity Politics and Bill Maher, a critical examination of policy and elitism. In recent years, Bill Maher has taken an increasingly critical stance on what he sees as the Democratic Party's overemphasis on identity politics, particularly race and gender. Maher, a prominent media figure, has argued that focusing too much on race is a strategic error for Democrats, and that it alienates voters who feel that their economic and social concerns are overshadowed by the party's emphasis on race, gender, and other identity markers. This perspective, however, deserves a deeper examination, particularly when viewed through the lens of his own elite social position and class-based assumptions. Bill Maher and Identity Politics. Bill Maher, as an elite white man, often approaches social and political discourse from a perspective that some would argue reflects a Gattaca-like view of society, where a meritocratic ideal is espoused, but in reality, class and privilege often dictate who rises and who remains marginalized. In the film Gattaca, society is stratified based on genetic predisposition, but this also serves as a metaphor for existing social hierarchies where class, race, and gender play key roles. Maher's criticisms, which often focus on Democrats' attention to marginalized groups, suggest that he overlooks the structural barriers that these groups face in favor of a more class-neutral analysis. The problem with Maher's critique of identity politics is that it sidesteps how systemic issues, racism, sexism, and classism, continue to affect everyday lives, especially for women, people of color, and the LGBTQ+ community. This view assumes that talking about race or gender is divisive rather than understanding that these identities intersect with economic policies that shape people's access to opportunities. Democratic and Republican policy, a side-by-side look. Democratic policies. Kamala Harris and social justice. As Vice President, Kamala Harris has been a strong advocate for social justice reforms. She has championed issues related to police reform, voting rights, and gender equality. Harris supports the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which seeks to protect voting access for marginalized communities, and has pushed for policies that address gender pay equity and reproductive rights, particularly in response to challenges to Roe v. Wade. Her policies reflect the Democratic Party's broader focus on addressing systemic inequalities. Economic and social equity. Democrats focus on policies that address income inequality, access to healthcare, and education. President Biden's administration has pushed for expanding the child tax credit, increasing healthcare access through the Affordable Care Act, and investing in public education, which disproportionately helps marginalized communities. Republican policies. Trump's Project 2025, a cornerstone of Trump's potential second-term agenda. Project 2025 is rooted in a conservative vision of America. The project is focused on rolling back many of the policies implemented by the Biden administration, including social safety nets and environmental regulations. One of its goals is to dismantle many of the regulatory protections related to civil rights, gender rights, and environmental protections. Trump and his allies view this project as a way to restore traditional American values, which many see as a code for preserving a social order that marginalizes non-white, non-male, and non-Christian groups. Trans rights and women's rights. The GOP has increasingly pursued policies that roll back protections for trans individuals, particularly in healthcare and sports. For example, multiple states have passed or proposed bans on gender-affirming care for trans youth. Republican lawmakers have also targeted reproductive rights, with numerous states passing highly restrictive abortion laws following the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. These policies directly impact marginalized groups, stripping away their freedoms in the name of protecting family values. Bill Maher, Elitism, and the Gattaca Analogy. Maher's worldview, influenced by his status as a wealthy, influential white man, can be compared to the elitist social structure in Gattaca. In the film, society is divided into the genetically valid and invalid, with those who are privileged genetically receiving all of society's benefits. While Maher advocates for meritocracy, his position often ignores how deeply ingrained structural barriers prevent many from accessing the so-called level playing field he envisions. Maher's critique of identity politics can be seen as part of a larger tendency within elite circles to dismiss the importance of race and gender in shaping access to resources and opportunities. His consistent downplaying of issues like systemic racism and sexism suggests a worldview that fails to account for the fact that not everyone starts at the same place in society. This good old white hierarchy he inadvertently defends is the very structure that perpetuates inequality, much like the eugenic system in Gattaca. The reality of policies affecting marginalized groups. The policies currently being debated in American politics have profound consequences for marginalized groups. Consider the following examples. Trans rights. The rollback of trans rights, particularly regarding access to gender-affirming healthcare, is an alarming development. Trans individuals, particularly youth, face higher rates of depression and suicide, and denying them healthcare exacerbates these problems. Women's rights. The erosion of reproductive rights following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade has had a catastrophic impact on women, particularly poor women and women of color, who are disproportionately affected by lack of access to abortion services and comprehensive reproductive health care. Public education funding. Republicans have pushed for expanding charter schools and private school vouchers, often at the expense of funding public schools, which predominantly serve low-income, Black, and brown communities. This further entrenches educational inequality and limits the upward mobility of marginalized communities. Housing and appraisal discrimination. Studies show that Black and brown homeowners are consistently discriminated against when it comes to housing appraisals, leading to lower property values and a diminished ability to accumulate wealth. This feeds into the broader issue of racial wealth inequality, which identity politics seeks to address. Conclusion: Identity politics and the struggle for equality. Bill Maher's critique of identity politics reveals the tension between class-based and identity-based approaches to social change. While economic policy is important, the lived realities of marginalized groups cannot be separated from issues of race, gender, and identity. Policies like Trump's Project 2025 and the stripping of trans and women's rights demonstrate the urgent need for an intersectional approach that recognizes the ways that race, gender, and class intersect to shape people's lives. The reality is that without identity politics, the voices of the most vulnerable are silenced, and the policy decisions made by those in power will continue to strip away freedoms from those who have historically been marginalized. The challenge for Democrats, and for critics like Maher, is to find a way to balance a focus on both economic and identity issues, ensuring that neither is neglected in the fight for a more just and equitable society.